and for indulging us by sitting in the center section. I'm Brenton Lights, and I work here with the Center for Human Rights and International Justice, and on behalf of the Center, as well as the Departments of Sociology and History and the Islamic Civilization and Societies, and the Students for Justice in Palestine, and a host of community co-sponsors who will be hosting additional events for the rest of the week. We're delighted not only to welcome you, but to welcome Medea Benjamin here to Boston College and to the greater Boston area. As some of you probably know, Medea is the co-founder of the woman-led peace group Code Pink, and also of the human rights group Global Exchange. She's been an advocate for social justice for more than 40 years, and has been described in a number of different ways by those who have recognized her leadership in the peace movement, as well as her leadership in social justice and social change activities and activism. She's received numerous awards and is a former economist and nutritionist with the United Nations and the World Health Organization. I learned earlier today that in 2000 she was a Green Party candidate for the California Senate. During the 1990s, she focused her efforts on tackling the problem of unfair trade as promoted by the World Trade Organization. Since September 11, 2001, she's been working to promote U.S. foreign policy that would respect human rights and gain us allies instead of contributing to violence and undermining our international reputation. She's organized numerous protests against the U.S. interventions in Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, and Syria. And she has, through this most recent publication, not only documented but is increasingly calling our attention as United Statesians to what she calls the kingdom of the unjust behind the U.S. and Saudi connection. She'll talk to us this evening about that work, and we'll have an ample opportunity for your questions and discussion after her presentation. Welcome, Medea. We're delighted to have you. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you. Well, very nice to be here, and I want to first talk about the Saudi Arabia and why I wrote the book, and then open it up to a broader look at our U.S. foreign policy and hopefully have a fruitful discussion about what we can do about it. I've been working around Middle East issues since 9/11 happened, and traveling to the Middle East many times, I became very involved in the Israel-Palestine conflict and have been involved around the Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions campaign, also known as BDS. Have been traveling many times to Iraq and Syria and Afghanistan and Lebanon and Yemen and Bahrain and all over the region. And as I traveled, I always noted the influence of the Saudis in different places. Somebody just told me yesterday, she said that she was living in the West Bank and doing a project there. She's from here, and she said, I was sitting at a cafe and this guy started talking to me, and he said, look over there, that big mosque over there, funded by the Saudis. Look over there, another mosque over there, funded by the Saudis. Look over that way, another mosque funded by the Saudis. Says, you know, we don't have enough food to eat, we don't have enough electricity, we don't have, and what are they doing? We don't need more mosques. And I would find that in so many places. The Saudis would be building these huge mosques, like in the Gaza Strip where people are desperate for everything. The Saudis come in and build these monstrous mosques. And people do wonder, why aren't they funding some more fundamental things? And I've also seen the influence of the Saudis in the kind of Islam that they promote. But I never did anything about it. And I always kind of wondered, why doesn't the peace movement talk about Saudi Arabia? Why isn't there some kind of movement around U.S. policy towards Saudi Arabia? And the more I looked and the more I realized it just didn't exist, I thought, wow, this is kind of crazy. So I did this book as really a basic primer. It's a very simple question and answer format to give a panoramic view of what is Saudi Arabia, what things are like inside the kingdom, and what their relationship with the outside world is about it, and where change might come about. So I enjoyed writing the book a lot, and I think it's an important book for people to have because of how little that we do tend to know about Saudi Arabia. In many ways, it's a very closed society. You can go there for the Hajj, for religious tourism, but you can't just go there as a person. You have to have a sponsor, have some kind of business connection. Even journalists have a very hard time getting into Saudi Arabia. Has anybody seen the PBS movie that came out? It was called Saudi Arabia Uncovered. You saw it? Yeah, a couple of you saw it, yeah. You might remember there, they made up some concocted story about some business they had that they wanted to do in Saudi Arabia. And then when they got inside, the Saudis realized that this was a made-up business and hacked into their website, and they were like, oh my God, we better get out of here. Quickly ran back to the hotel, packed their bags, and got out. So that's one of the reasons we don't know very much about Saudi Arabia. When I did the book, I started with the very basic of, what is this country that's named after a family? You know, the Saud family, and how it came about with a connection between a very ambitious and violent family, the Saud family, that wanted to conquer more and more territory, and we're going back now to the 1700s, and a Imam, Muhammad Wahab, who had a very strange and narrow-minded fundamentalist interpretation of the Quran, and said that anybody who didn't do it his way was an infidel, and then justified killing them, which was perfect for the Saud family because it gave them this religious justification for going around and conquering more and more territory, till they got hold of Mecca and Medina, the holiest lands for the in Islam, and then in 1932 declared it a kingdom and put the name of the family, the Saud family, Saudi Arabia. I think that this very narrow-minded, repressive connection between the two would have gone down in the dustbin of history a long time ago, overthrown by the people of the region, had it not been for the discovery of oil, the discovery of oil. And that's where the West comes in. And the Western world, in fact, what is today Chevron, got the first concession for drilling for oil, discovered more oil than they ever thought was possible. And the US and the Western world then decided we need a strong relationship with Saudi Arabia, which was really cemented during World War II in a very famous visit by Franklin Delano Roosevelt with the Saudi king. And Franklin Delano Roosevelt basically saying, not in these words, but something like, you can keep your repressive regime and do what you want internally to your people, and we will make sure you are not overthrown by them or by outsiders as long as you keep selling us your oil. So this oil for security is really, in some ways you could say, a pact with the devil, but I guess they're both devils because, you know, it's US companies that were benefiting from this, and now it's been US companies that have propped up the Saudi regime for decade after decade after decade, Democratic presidents, Republican presidents. So as much as I criticize the Saudi regime, I wanted to be clear that, you know, what's really propping this up has been our country and the Western world. And the other thing that's important to note is that while criticizing the narrow-minded, perverted version of Islam that the Saudis represent and spread around the world is not to be confused with Islamophobia. Many people in the Muslim community, in fact, I've been speaking in a number of mosques, and they're really happy to have people speaking out against the Wahhabi Saudi version of Islam, saying that this is not representative of what the vast majority of Muslims practice and believe in. So you have this kingdom formed in the early 1930s, and then over the decades, firming up its grip on the population. And I live in Washington, D.C. I go to hearings all the time, and it's funny when you go to some of these armed services or foreign relations hearings, they're talking about the war on terrorism, the spread of terrorism, and they're always talking about Iran. Iran is the worst country in the world. It's the most extremist. It's spreading terrorism. It's and they have the worst elections in Iran. They're not free and fair. The government controls who's going to run. Well, a lot of the criticism is valid, but it's much more applicable to Saudi Arabia. And Saudi Arabia, they just don't even bother having elections. There's no future elections because there's no elections. There's no election for a president or a prime minister. There's no Congress. Out of pressure from inside and outside, they finally started in 2005 these municipal elections, but they're really quite ridiculous because half of the seats were appointed just in case the wrong people got elected, and they don't have any legislative power. They're really for giving some suggestions on where the park should be and how garbage should be collected, but they have no legislative power. And women were not even allowed to participate until 2015. So you also have no freedom of speech, no freedom of assembly, no freedom of association, and Saudi Arabia is one of the countries that has a very heavy use of the death penalty. Death penalty in Saudi Arabia is usually by beheading, and there's all kinds of non-violent reasons that you could be put to death. For example, is there anybody here who is an atheist? Okay.
Not at BC.
Anybody part of the gay community? Sorry. Do we have any sorcerers in the room? These are all things that you could be put to death for in Saudi Arabia. How about bloggers? Do we have bloggers? You'd be gone many times over, sorry. There's a case that has gotten a lot of publicity because Amnesty International has taken on as an example of one of many cases, a young man, Raif Badawi, who is a blogger, who his blogs were about we should be more free-thinking in Saudi Arabia. We should have discussions about what we want our government to be and a separation between religion and the government. And for this, he was accused of insulting Islam, spreading atheism, originally sentenced to death, then commuted to 10 years in prison and 1,000 lashes. His lawyer was convicted and sentenced to 15 years in prison. This is the way that dissent is dealt with. You also have major populations that face discrimination from the time they're born. For example, women. What do you think of when you think of Saudi women?
Not driving.
Can't drive.
So it's funny that people always say can't drive. And I guess it is the only country in the world where women are not allowed to drive. But that is not the biggest problem that Saudi women face. Neither is it the fact that they have to be covered in public. The biggest problem they face is that they live under a system that's called a guardianship system. And from the time you're born to the time you die, you have to have a man who is your legal guardian who approves or disapproves of every major decision in your life. And if you have an enlightened guardian, you can have a pretty good life in Saudi Arabia. And there are many women who are well educated, who are working, who even can own their own businesses, marry who they want, when they want. If you have a bad guardian, then your life can be hell. And many women do face a lot of restrictions in their lives because their guardian, who is probably their father when they're young, doesn't want them to be doing these kinds of things. Now, women have made a lot of strides in Saudi Arabia, and we could talk about that more in the discussion part, because it is important to recognize things are not static, and that women, just like other people in Saudi Arabia, have been fighting for many years to change their government. In Saudi Arabia, on the driving issue, starting in 1990, there was a round of women who did civil disobedience by getting in the cars and started to drive, and were arrested and lost their jobs, were sentenced to lashes, were not allowed to travel. And then, lo and behold, some years later, another group of women would try to do it, and another group of women would try to do it. Where they have been more successful is in fighting for more rights around education. Because originally, the government said, okay, we'll give you education, ha ha ha. It was under the Ministry of Religious Affairs, and the education was, you can sit here and read the Quran all day, and we will prepare you to be good wives. And the women fought against that and say, you know, we want the same kind of broad-based religion that the boys are getting. And finally, the government relented and they placed the girls' schools under the Ministry of Education, just like the boys' schools. They're still gender segregated. It is the most gender segregated society in the world. But women now can get a good education, and the majority of students in university are women right now. It's difficult when they get out of school to get a job because it costs more to hire a woman. You have to gender segregate the workplace. The women can't drive. So the highest unemployment rate is among the most educated women. So then you have other groups that are discriminated against, and one of those is the foreign workers. You might have read some things about foreign workers, not just in Saudi Arabia, but in the Gulf states in general. So there's one type of worker that usually are the Western workers. They work for the big oil company. By the way, the oil company in Saudi Arabia called Aramco is the largest company, not oil company, company in the world by far. Way bigger than Google and Apple and Exxon and all of those. It's like worth, the worth is a state secret, but it's way over $1 trillion. So there's a lot of foreigners who come and work for the oil companies, and they live in separate compounds, and they get really good wages, and they have decent conditions. I'm talking about the workers who come from poor countries like India, Bangladesh, Indonesia, Philippines, and their problem is similar to the problem of women, like the sponsorship system. They have, like the guardianship system, they have a sponsorship system. So you can't say, you know, say you're in Bangladesh and you're from a poor family and you hear that there's jobs that are well paid in Saudi Arabia. You say, I'm going to save money and I'm going to go to Saudi Arabia and I'm going to get myself a job. That's not how it works. You have to go to a recruiter, you have to pay a recruitment fee, then the recruiter finds a sponsor inside Saudi Arabia and say, Paul, you're the sponsor, and you want her to come and clean your house. So you are the sponsor and you promise all these, you know, decent wage and a day off because you're a really nice guy. And you know, good conditions, and then she comes and lo and behold finds that Paul has totally lied to you, that he's not such a nice guy, that you don't get that day off, that you're not getting paid what they said you were going to be paid, they're barely even feeding you, and they're miserable to you, and you're miserable, and you say, you know, I've had enough, I want to go home. Well, first of all, you can't go until you've paid off your recruitment fee. And second of all, you can't even leave the country until Paul gives you an exit visa. You have to sign the exit visa for her to be able to leave the country. So it's like modern day indentured servitude. In fact, slavery was only eliminated in 1962 in Saudi Arabia. So then there's another group in Saudi Arabia that is discriminated against. And I was naive enough when I started doing this research that I thought because Saudi Arabia is a theocracy, it's a country based on a religion, that they would have respect for freedom of religion. It's only freedom of religion if you practice Sunni Islam the way the Wahhabi want you to practice it. If you're a Sufi that believes in a more relaxed with music and dance, no, 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 no. If you were a Shia, the minority, Islam, they tend to live in the eastern part of the country, which also tends to be where the oil is. And the Saudi rulers have been terribly afraid all these decades that the Shia would rise up and take their oil with them. and they have been repressing the Shia population, not allowing them to practice their religion publicly the way they would like to, discriminating against them in the school system, in the job market. So the Shia have periodically risen up and been crushed by the Saudi military. The other groups, Saudi Arabia is the only country where you are not allowed to build a church. And that you can only be a Saudi citizen if you are Muslim. And of the foreign workers who are there, 2 million of them are Christian. Like many of the Filipinos who are there are Christians. And they would like to be able to worship publicly. They are not allowed to do that. Now, another thing I discovered was that there was a piece of legislation passed in the United States in 1998 called the International Freedom of Religion Act. Anybody heard of that? Yeah. So this act says that we are a country that loves religion, and we are going to look around the world and see who are the countries that are the worst in terms of allowing people to practice their religion freely, and those countries that are the worst, we're going to do something to hurt them, we're going to sanction them. And so every year, our tax dollars are used to do this congressional mandated study, and the countries that are the worst are North Korea, Burma always comes in the bottom, and these countries are sanctioned. Well, guess what other country always comes in at the bottom among the worst? Saudi Arabia. But Saudi Arabia doesn't get sanctioned. So I couldn't understand why that was until I discovered that in 2004, the State Department had passed an indefinite waiver, meaning a waiver you don't have to renew every single year, that says the Saudis will not be held accountable. Go figure. So I talked about Wahhabism internally inside Saudi Arabia, and then you have to look at Wahhabism being spread outside Saudi Arabia, which is a relatively new phenomenon, because it only happened after 1979 with the Iranian Revolution. Iran is a Shia country. The Shia have, when they had their revolution in 1979, the Saudis were worried that the Iranians would be seen as the guardians of Islam, that they would be spreading their version of religion, and the Saudis wanted to get out there and stop that. And so they used a lot of this vast oil wealth to be building the mosques, like I talked about in the West Bank, not only in the Middle East, but to be doing it in North Africa and Europe, and to be building schools, bringing in teachers and imams to Saudi Arabia, training them, sending them back out in the world. And this has had a big impact on many of the places where the Saudis have put their resources. You might have recalled that even President Obama talked about his time in Indonesia when there was this very relaxed version of Islam that was being practiced, and that little by little, with the Saudis coming in and the influence of Saudi money, there were places in Indonesia that then became more radicalized. Well, this is a phenomenon that has happened in many places around the world, and our government knows it very well. In fact, there have been some leaked cables that show that Hillary Clinton, when she was Secretary of State, kind of pulling out her hair saying, what are we going to do about these Saudis, our allies? They keep spreading extremism and funding extremist groups. So it wasn't just spreading the ideology, it was also funding groups. And Joe Biden, who sometimes just can't stop himself, was talking to a group of students, and he said, talking about the spread of terrorism, and said, sometimes our biggest problems are our allies, like the Saudis. He got to the White House and he was told he had to apologize to Saudi Arabia. But, it's crazy. So look at what happened in 9/11. 15 of the 19 hijackers coming from Saudi Arabia. and the 9/11 families for the last 15 years trying to sue the Saudi government in court. It took them 15 years to get the right to do that. Finally, just last month, Congress passed legislation saying, yes, these 9/11 families can sue the government of Saudi Arabia. Well, what the 9/11 families really want, it's not about money. They want information. And they think that there is a lot of information that's been hidden from the American public about how high up the connections went between people in the Saudi government and some of the hijackers. And it's something we really don't know. According to former Senator Bob Graham, who used to be the head of the Intelligence Committee in the Senate and was the head of one of the 9/11 commissions, he says there's 80,000 pages worth of documents, mostly from the FBI, and it's only through a court process of discovery can some of that information get out. Well, the US has been protecting the Saudis all these years, and the fact that Obama vetoed the legislation to protect the Saudis. Now, he also said something quite interesting, not in these same words, but basically said, if we allow the Saudis to be sued in US courts, imagine all the places around the world where we commit war crimes, where they're going to want to be suing us. In any case, Congress overrode that veto, which is quite remarkable because, first of all, it's the only time ever in Obama's presidency that a veto has been overridden. And second, it's the only time ever that the majority of Congress has done something in favor of the American people and against the Saudi government. So we have the issue of the spread of ideology, of the support for extremist groups, the Saudis in Syria supporting the Al-Qaeda affiliate, the Saudis in Bahrain crushing the democracy movement there, and we'll talk more about the Saudis in Yemen. And when I really was so amazed that the US continues to have such a strong relationship with the country that's most responsible for the spread of extremism. And I thought, well, it must just be about oil. Until I realized that only 13% of the oil we import comes from Saudi Arabia. We could be getting all of that oil from Canada, from elsewhere. And in the meantime, something else has happened, which the Saudis have become absolutely essential for holding up the military-industrial complex in this country. The Saudis have become by far the #1 purchaser of US weapons. We have sold weapons to Saudi Arabia more than we have ever sold to any other country in the world, and the majority of the bulk of the weapon sales have happened under the Obama administration. It's just under the Obama administration that we have sold $115 billion worth of weapons to Saudi Arabia in 43 separate deals. It is quite amazing. Now, Congress has the power, if it wants to stop a weapons deal. But Congress has been just rubber stamping every weapons deal. And I would say that's for a couple of reasons. One, because the weapons manufacturers are very powerful in this country. They're very smart. I mean, you've got Raytheon right here. Every single district in the United States has some weapons manufacturer. And they give money to Congress people, and those Congress people then continue to vote for these weapons sales and say we couldn't possibly stop it because it would mean a cut in jobs in my community. And this very corrupt system is one that is fed by the weapons manufacturers, but they need to sell the weapons, and Saudi Arabia is a willing buyer. And so you have the constant sales of more and more sophisticated weapons to this very, very repressive regime. In the meantime, the Saudis have done other things to ingratiate themselves or become more intricately involved in the web of the Western economies, and that's by using a lot of the oil wealth to invest. And in the US, they have invested hundreds of billions of dollars in treasury bonds. In fact, that was a threat that they made when the Congress was about to pass the bill allowing them to be sued. They said, you know, you sue us and we'll pull out $750 billion worth of assets that we have in your economy. It turned out to be an empty bluff because the oil sales are in dollars and they would be hurt probably more than we would be if they pulled out their money and the dollar dove. But in any case, they have invested in all kinds of Wall Street firms, in real estate, in communications. They recently invested $3.5 billion in Uber. So much money in Uber that they got a seat on the Uber board. They do something else, which is they give money to Ivy League schools. You might know some Ivy League schools that have gotten Saudi money. Harvard, Yale. They give money to think tanks on the right and the left, in the middle. Some very liberal think tanks like the Atlantic Council or the Brookings Institute have gotten money from the Saudis. Some very well-known foundations that you might have heard of.
Begins with a C.
Begins with a C, ends with an N. The Clinton Foundation, I loved it on that. If you watched the debate last night, to me, the best line was when Donald Trump said, "You should give back the money you took from the Saudis." I thought that was wonderful. But, so yes, the Clinton Foundation has taken between $10 and $25 million from the Saudis. Even the lovely Jimmy Carter Foundation that has such great programs for empowering women and girls, take money from the Saudis. I was sitting in a hearing that was being chaired by John McCain, head of the Armed Services Committee, and it was a hearing about spread of terrorism, of course. And of course he was going on and on about Iran. And I was trying to keep quiet because I didn't want to be arrested. I get arrested a lot in those hearings, and it's a big pain in the butt. And so, I was just, don't say anything, don't say anything, don't say anything. But the more and more he talked about Iran, I just couldn't help myself. And I said, why don't you ever talk about Saudi Arabia? As he called in the police, I started Googling John McCain, Saudi Arabia, and guess what popped up? A Bloomberg News report saying John McCain Foundation had taken $1 million from Saudi Arabia. It's so insidious. I mean, it really is. And then the last piece of it is that they hire all these companies to put like a happy face on Saudi Arabia, and that's all these different lobby firms. There are 10 lobby firms that are registered foreign agents of the Saudi government. And a lot of these lobby firms are former senators from the Democrats and from the Republicans. And they want to get both sides. They're hedging their bets. And one of the firms that is involved with the Saudis is called the Podesta Group. Anybody heard of a famous Podesta?
Yeah, Tony's brother John.
And John is what? What's his job now?
He's running the campaign.
He is the chairperson of Hillary Clinton's presidential campaign. He and his brother started a lobby group called the Podesta Group. He used to be the chief of staff for Bill Clinton. He has all these great connections, and they said, well, why don't we make some money from these connections? Let's form a lobby group. They formed a lobby group. In the meantime, John Podesta went to run Hillary Clinton's campaign, and Tony Podesta became a registered foreign agent of the Saudi government, his Podesta Group getting $140,000 every month from the Saudis. So it is just incredible, the kind of ties that we have with this Saudi regime. And this was all very quiet until recently. And recently, the issue about Saudi involvement in Yemen has taken a greater role. The Saudis were very upset with Obama last year when he negotiated the Iran nuclear deal. Both the Israelis and the Saudis didn't want that to happen. It went through. Saudis not happy about that. But the Obama administration said, don't worry, we'll sell you even better weapons, even more sophisticated weapons. And so the weapons deals kept going through. But in the meantime, in the past, the Saudis did use the weapons to repress people internally, and they did use the weapons to crush the Bahrain uprising, and they did use the weapons to fund these very extremist rebels in Syria. But they really used the United States to, quote, protect them. And a lot of these weapons were just shiny toys that were building up in the desert until the Saudis decided to get involved in Yemen. So just like George Bush thought, we'll go into Iraq, overthrow Saddam Hussein, it'll all be over in less than a month, the Saudis will pay for it. In the intervention in Yemen into internal civil strife, when the Saudis saw the uprising of a group called the Houthis that they thought were going to be too close to Iran because they were close to the Shias, the Saudis thought, we're going to go in there, drop some bombs, get rid of the Houthis, put our guy back, and everything will be fine. Well, that was 19 months ago. And the Saudis have been bombarding the country that was already the poorest country in the Arab Peninsula, in the Arab world, and turning it into an absolute catastrophe. There was a study that was done that showed that 1/3 of the bombing attacks had been civilian targets. And these included several hospitals run by Doctors Without Borders. It included schools, neighborhoods, marketplaces, weddings, and you might have recalled last week, last Saturday, when they hit a funeral home right in downtown capital of Sana'a, where there were 1,000 mourners. And they sent in the bombs, killed many people. When rescuers came in, sent in the next round, killed over 140 people, wounding over 500 people. And this was like considered the last straw. The international community, the UN, they said, come on, this has gotten just too much. There has to be a stop to this. And and John Kerry finally put his foot down and said to the Saudis, there has to be a stop to this. And so as of yesterday, there's a 72-hour ceasefire that's put in place that's supposed to lead to peace talks. There already was a round of peace talks that failed, so we have no idea if this is going to work. But it's a very good thing that there is a lull in the fighting right now, a lull in the bombing, and hopefully peace talks may be successful this time. In the meantime, there are some people in Congress who have been saying, okay, enough is enough. We haven't had enough of them to stop the weapon sales, but we did have one victory with one little piece of the weapon sales, and that is around the cluster bombs. The US was selling cluster bombs. I mean, you might not know it, but cluster bombs, according to the international community, have been banned. And the United States is one of the only countries that hasn't agreed to that ban. And there is a company called Textron that is the only company that continued to produce cluster bombs in the United States. Now, it is here in New England, and the Quakers for years have been protesting outside the headquarters, right?
In Providence.
In Providence. And when it became known through a Human Rights Watch report that cluster bombs were being used in Yemen, and they showed that they were from the United States, you want to say what you all did?
Well, a group of people from Mass Peace Action, American Friends Service Committee, went out to the Wilmington plant of Textron. Not sure exactly where the cluster bombs are being produced, but it's a huge manufacturing plant out there in Wilmington. And we had a demonstration for several hours along the highway there. Got a lot of good feedback, got some press coverage.
And in the meantime, there were people who were protesting at their headquarters, and lots of us who were protesting in Washington, D.C., both at Congress and the White House and at the Saudi embassy. And the pressure was enough to call for a vote in Congress, which came very close. I think it was 204 to 216. We lost by just a little bit, but enough that Obama put a halt on the sale of cluster bombs. And then Textron said it was going to stop producing cluster bombs. So that is a rare victory. But we have to do much more around the weapons sales, and I think it's really important, and Paul will be talking about some other things that folks here can be doing. But I wanted to sum up my part by saying that while we are working, and I'm very excited as I go around the country because I'm finding a lot of enthusiasm for doing something about this, and people going, you are lucky you have 2 senators who voted the right way, but in most of the country, they don't have that. So people have been doing sit-ins in their senator's office or their congressperson's office, and we know that there are going to be a lot more weapons sales coming up that we're going to have to oppose. In the meantime, it's also important to be supporting people inside Saudi Arabia who are working for change, as well as the Saudis in the diaspora who are working for change. And it's very hard. Some of us who've worked in solidarity movements for many years, we can't go and visit them. Many Saudis are afraid to publicly criticize their own government. These connections are more difficult than in most places. You came to the Saudi summit, remember, in Washington, D.C. We had a bunch of Saudis who were going to speak at that summit. We brought hundreds of people together, both academics and activists. Every one of the Saudis got a visit from the Saudi embassy telling them, you better not speak in that summit, you better not even attend the summit. And what's so funny about that is we asked the Saudi embassy, they said because it's one-sided. And we had been begging them to come and speak. We'd been begging our own State Department to come and speak. We begged anybody who wanted to defend the Saudi government to please come and have a platform, and we would ask everybody to be respectful. We couldn't get them to come and speak. So it's very hard to have these kind of people-to-people solidarity ties, but thanks to the internet, we can do it. And while the government tries to crack down on the internet, it's just too big. And social media in Saudi Arabia is huge. So we have a lot of ties through the internet with people inside Saudi Arabia. We oftentimes get messages from them. We're focusing this week on this group of prisoners. Will you help us tweet this out? Will you go to Congress for us and talk about this prisoner? We also, working with women who just 2 weeks ago put out a petition signed by thousands of women asking for an end to the guardianship system. Another petition put out by a group of lawyers in Saudi Arabia who said, we're not even trying to overthrow the monarchy because we're afraid if the monarchy would be overthrown, then groups like ISIS will come in and take over. And we look at Libya and we look at Syria and Iraq, and it would be way worse. So believe me, we don't want to overthrow you. We just want some reforms. And what we would like is a constitution. There are constitutional monarchies all over the world, and so they function quite well. The government has not agreed to a constitution, but the point is that thousands of them have signed a request, and that we can be promoting what they are doing. So I feel that as is the case all over the world, it is not up to us to change the Saudi government. It is up to us to stop supporting the Saudi regime. And it is up to us to be finding ways that we can lift the voices and the stories of the people inside and outside Saudi Arabia who are trying to change their own government for the better. So thank you very much for listening. And Paul, maybe you could say what people can do here, and I'm going to pass around a sign-up sheet if anybody wants to stay in touch with us, and then we'll open for questions.
That'd be great. Yeah, I think we want to get into questions as soon as possible. I'll just mention a few things. I'm Paul Shannon with American Friends Service Committee in Cambridge. First of all, if any of you have people that would like to hear Medea who aren't here tonight, I'll just pass these posters around. She's speaking in Cambridge tomorrow night, and she's speaking in Boston at Community Church of Boston. And just hand it back if you've already seen it on Saturday night. The other thing is, Medea's book is outside, right? After the event tonight, you can buy a copy of her book.
Yes.
It is a very important book. You won't believe the information that's in it. Just tremendous documentation, tremendous information that we have to know about how our country has been connected to Saudi Arabia for such a long time. I'm just going to mention that we're trying to get a Saudi Arabia campaign going here, because not just in Yemen, but throughout the Middle East, this relationship between us and the Saudis has just been disastrous for people. People don't even know that Saudi Arabia funded our war against Nicaragua in the 1980s. We in Saudi Arabia sent Osama bin Laden to Afghanistan originally. So it's just, if you look into this history that's in this book, you won't find this information anywhere else altogether. Medea brings it all together in that book, so be sure to buy it after this. We're having a rally next Thursday night at MIT, in front of MIT, because of their collaboration with a key Saudi institute that is connected to research and development on weapons. So if any of you are interested, Bob, you want to take one of these? And I'll just, you know, this may be something you can't do right now, but I just want you to know about it. We would love to have you show up. What you can do right now, however, is sign a couple of petitions we have. Like I said, we're just trying to get this campaign off the ground. The first petition is to the the chairman of the board of Raytheon. Raytheon made the bombs that just killed those 150 people in Yemen and wounded another 500. We have pictures of those bombs. They're made right here. We pay, Raytheon, we're all connected to Raytheon in this state, whether we know it or not. They run the show here. And so this is a petition. I'll just hand any around in case you agree with it. If you feel like signing it now, just hand one over to this side, one over there. And then a much simpler petition will be this one here, asking our congressional delegation to do what they can to block the transfer of these weapons to Saudi Arabia. So I'll just start that here. While Medea is taking questions, anyone who can sign these things now would be great. I can just collect them later. If you want a copy of these at the end that you think you can get other people to sign, that would be terrific. And now, as Americans, we have a responsibility. We are heavily involved in the Yemen war. We provide the targeting for the Saudis. We do the refueling of their bombers, and we make their bombers. We're there. It's our war. And it's an unbelievably, it's a war filled with war crimes constantly. And it's just something we cannot be silent about anymore. Thank you. And let's go some questions.
Okay, I think we have time for questions, comments.
Yeah.
Well, it's interesting to see that the Israel lobby has been so silent about these great sales to Saudi Arabia. Remember back in the 80s when they were trying to stop the AWAC sales, and it was a huge political fight over that, which eventually they lost. It was one of their first major setbacks, but it wasn't repeated after that, and a lot of the people who were trying to push it through were targeted after that in congressional and senatorial elections. But there seems to be a budding relationship between Israel and Saudi Arabia. I know Salman al-Ansari was recently, last month, just advocated such a strategic kind of alliance between them because of their common, obvious enemy. But there's then that split between Arab governments and the so-called Arab street, which makes it very difficult for them to rationalize this. But behind the scenes, it would be every indication that they're moving closer together. And what that means for the future is not very optimistic, but it's also extremely uncertain. I mean, everything's clouded behind closed doors. It's difficult for you. You can only guess based on certain signs and symbols and slips that they make to see where they're headed with this. But I mean, it's certainly a closer relationship than it's ever been. And I don't know what that's going to foretell in the future.
So you bring up such interesting points because for credibility in the Arab street, one of the Saudi policies has been to support Palestinians. I mentioned how they're building all these mosques, but they were also giving lots of money to other Palestinian things. They did come up with a peace plan in 2001, which was a good peace plan.
It was.
And the Israelis didn't accept it. Because of the Iran nuclear deal, it's brought Saudi Arabia and Israel close together. While they still don't have diplomatic ties, they never have. Saudi Arabia was boycotting Israel as part of the Arab boycott until they joined the World Trade Organization. They had to stop that boycott because you can't boycott another member. But in any case, it's only now where they have had covert relations, they have now become overt. They now are appearing together in meetings, and they are trying to figure out how to undo the nuclear deal in the next administration. And I think that is extremely dangerous. And the Palestinians feel like they've been thrown under the bus by this relationship with Israel.
They always are. The Saudis have been, all talk at the Arab League, but they don't do anything except try and tamp down the Palestinian resistance. When they stepped in, when Hamas was forced out of Syria, they did it mainly to buy them off and to prevent them really from agitating very much. And they didn't support the PNA dying, which is really for internal dissent more than anything else. So
Right.
the Saudis have been a huge disappointment that way, even though the population is overwhelmingly, on the side of resistance. I don't know what that's going to go, but it looks like as long as they have an iron hand, they're going to go a different way from their populations and a lot of things.
Other comments, questions?
Here's one over here.
Oh, sorry.
Throughout history, probably the hardest thing to do is wrest power away from people that are absolutists and, maniacal about keeping their power. So what can we do here other than quit selling them arms, which I would do instantaneously, and maintenance for said arms? What can we here do to be able to help the Saudi people get out from under the thumb? Because without the Roman armies, Caesar would have been alone, and they would have never conquered anything. And once the oil is gone, I wish the Saudis a lot of luck selling sand. We got plenty of that. So what can we do?
So there is the issue of the weapons sales. There is a coalition that we've helped to put together of interfaith and atheist groups, actually, that are trying to get the State Department waiver lifted so that Saudi Arabia would be sanctioned. There's the issue of supporting the human rights activists inside Saudi Arabia. We did a little video of a young man who was arrested at 17 years old for nonviolent dissent. He was from the Shia community, and we had gotten some footage from his family inside Saudi Arabia. We put it out, and we thought maybe a couple of thousand people would watch it. We had 4 million views, and when we looked, it was Saudis. And the family told us that this is one of the only reasons that he is still alive is because of the widespread publicity that his case is getting. The same is true for Raif Badawi, the blogger, who was sentenced to 1,000 lashes. He was given the first 50 lashes in a public place. It was filmed, put out to the world, and then the Saudis were too embarrassed to do it again. So he hasn't received the 950 other lashes, although he's still in prison. So we can be doing things to spread the word about some of these prisoners. And the other thing we're doing is trying to make it, try to make these groups ashamed of taking Saudi money and renounce taking Saudi money. So no dirty dollars from dictators campaign. And we've gone to some of the Congress people who have taken money from Saudi lobbyists, asked them to stop taking it. We asked Donald Trump to ask Hillary Clinton to give back the money. No. We're trying to get to the Podesta Group, and so we have a whole campaign with the universities as well. And then I would go back to the issue of it's really about our weapons manufacturers and what are we going to do to stop them, not just around Saudi Arabia, but in general. And so there is a lot more talk now about a campaign to divest from the weapons manufacturers using the model that the environmentalists have used around the fossil fuel industry. And I think that a great place to be doing that is at Catholic universities. Because when the Pope came, he said, why are we selling weapons to places that are using it to abuse people so terribly? The answer is greed, and these companies have blood on their hands. So there you got it right from the Pope, and I think any Catholic university worth its salt will divest from all the weapons industries.
I had a few questions. If you don't get to them all, that's fine. You said that people were killed by beheading. Does that mean guillotine?
No, it's a sword.
Okay. Wow. Do you have a sense of how many beheadings there are per year?
There were 157 deaths last year. We don't know if the majority were by beheading, some of them are by firing squad, but they don't give the bodies back usually to the family, so a lot of times the family doesn't know. For example, this year started out with a massive killing of, I think it was 47 people on January 2nd, and one of them was a very beloved Shia leader, Nimr al-Nimr. The family has never received his body. They don't know if he was beheaded or if he was shot. And so far this year, I think there have been about 142 executions. Okay. They also have a very macabre thing that is translated as crucifixion. And that is cutting off the head and then putting up the body and leaving it there for a couple of days as a warning to the public.
In a public space.
In a public space.
You wonder why they talk about the Islamic State doing these same things.
Yeah. Where do they get these ideas?
I was wondering if the other Gulf states and or Iran had systems similar to the guardianship system or sponsorship system.
The other Gulf states do. Iran doesn't, because Iran does not use foreign workers to that. No, not at all. I mean, you have Iranians doing the jobs that foreign workers would do.
But how about for Iranian women, the guardianship?
The guardianship system, it's a similar system, not as stringent, but similar. Does anybody not get to sign?
Yeah, last question. I heard something, I don't remember when, about like the foreign minister of Pakistan, some official in Pakistan, saying that if Iran were to ever get a nuclear weapon, Pakistan would give one, just unilaterally give weapons to Saudi Arabia. I'm wondering if you've heard about that, if you know it's credible, and if you know the U.S.'s position on something like that.
Well, who knows if it's credible, and the U.S. says no, so, it's not like you can just give your nuclear weapon to another state without the international community getting involved and saying, no, you can't do this. But Donald Trump said it would be okay for Saudi Arabia and Korea, South Korea to have nuclear weapons. Pakistan uses it as a leverage point in negotiating with the U.S. to get more money. Yes?
Two questions. First, what is some of the most frequent criticism you hear about your work? And the second one is, given everything you've told us tonight, how are you going to vote in November?
So the most frequent criticism of the work, particularly around Saudi Arabia, or the work of Code Pink in general?
Particularly around Saudi Arabia.
So particularly around Saudi Arabia, I think some people would say that Saudi Arabia is one of the most stable countries in the Middle East, and we need allies who are stable, and they have been reliable allies, and we work with them on counterintelligence, which is really funny because, if they're the ones indeed that are funding and spreading these terrorist groups, and then they tell us about it, and then they use that as a reason we have to be friends with them. They threatened, for example, in England when there was a court case against a Saudi who used to be the U.S. ambassador here, Bandar, for taking big kickbacks from a big weapons company called BAE Systems. They threatened the British government that they were not going to cooperate on counterterrorism anymore unless they stopped the court case, and they stopped the court case. So people use these excuses that we need them for cooperation and we need them for stability, and those would be the biggest criticisms, I think. In terms of how I'm going to vote in November, I live in Washington, D.C. It will be a big love fest for Hillary Clinton, and so I can vote for Jill Stein and not worry about my vote and feel that I voted for somebody who represents my values.
Well, thank you, Medea, so very much for being with us, for the work that you and Code Peak are doing, for the book that you've presented, and I'd like to encourage all of